Clara Whitmore did not cry when they dragged her to the courthouse. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing in Red Hollow. She was 19 years old, wearing a dress that didn't fit, standing in front of a man she had never spoken to, and the entire town had come to watch her humiliation, like it was a celebration. She stared at the ground. Caleb Stone stared at her. Then he did something that silenced every single person in that square. He took a step back and said, "She is not mine to keep." If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this has traveled. The summer of 1879 arrived in Red Hollow, Montana, like it always did. Heavy and unforgiving, pressing down on the valley between the mountains, with a heat that made men short-tempered and women invisible. Clara Whitmore had learned to be invisible long before the heat ever made it necessary. She was 19 years old, and she had spent the better part of those 19 years understanding one thing with absolute clarity. In Red Hollow, a woman without a father, without money, and without the right last name was not a person. She was a problem. Something to be passed from one hand to another until someone finally agreed to take responsibility for her. That morning she woke before dawn. Not because she wanted to, but because her Aunt Vera had been standing at the foot of her cot since 4 a.m, arms crossed, mouth set in a hard line that meant the decision had already been made, and Clara's opinion of it had never once been considered. "Get up," Vera said, "and wear the blue dress." Clara sat up slowly. She looked at her aunt's face and saw nothing there that resembled affection. What she saw was relief. The particular kind of relief a person feels when they are about to be free of a burden they never wanted in the first place. "What's happening today?" Clara asked, though something in her chest already knew. "You're getting married," Vera said, and turned away before she finished the sentence, as if the conversation was already over. Clara didn't move for a long moment. She sat on the edge of the cot with her bare feet on the cold floorboards and stared at the wall across from her. The blue dress was hanging on a nail. It had belonged to her mother. It was too large in the shoulders and too short at the hem, and Clara had worn it exactly twice, both times to funerals. She thought that was probably appropriate. She put it on. She braided her hair without a mirror. She did not eat breakfast because Vera did not offer her any, and Clara had stopped asking for things she was not offered long before she was old enough to understand why that was. When she walked out of the house and into the blazing morning sun, she found 2 men on horseback waiting in the road. She recognized one of them as Deputy Hale, a narrow-faced man who always looked slightly embarrassed by whatever he was doing. The other she did not know. "Miss Whitmore," Deputy Hale said, not meeting her eyes. "We're escorting you to the courthouse." "Is that what this is called?" Clara said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer, neither did the man beside him. She walked between their horses all the way to the center of town, and she held her chin level the entire way, because that was the one thing she had learned she could still control. Not what happened to her, not what people said, not what arrangements were made in back rooms by men who had never once asked her what she wanted, but her chin. She could hold that level. She could refuse to let them see her break. Red Hollow's courthouse was a square, ugly building that sat at the top of the main street like it was trying to look important. By the time Clara arrived, a crowd had already gathered on the steps and along the boardwalk on either side. She recognized most of the faces. Mrs. Aldrich, the seamstress, who had once refused to let Clara try on a pair of gloves because she couldn't afford to buy them. The Pearson brothers, who had laughed at her at the harvest dance 3 years ago when she'd arrived without a partner. Pastor Green, who had preached twice about the virtue of charity and had never once extended any toward her. They were all watching her now. Some of them were whispering. A few were outright staring with the kind of naked curiosity that people only allow themselves when they believe the person they're staring at doesn't matter enough to deserve privacy. Clara heard pieces of what they said as she passed. "Wonder if he knows what he's getting. Girl's never going to make anyone a real wife, you ask me." Vera practically begged them to take her off her hands. She kept walking. She kept her chin level. Inside the courthouse, the room was smaller and hotter than she expected. There was a table at the front with 2 chairs behind it, and standing off to the left, half turned away from her, was the tallest man Clara Whitmore had ever seen in her life. He had his back to the room when she entered. He was wearing a dark vest over a rough linen shirt, and his shoulders were broad enough that they blocked the window behind him entirely. His hair was black and longer than was typical, and he hadn't shaved in what looked like several weeks. When she came through the door, he turned. His face was hard, not cruel. There was a difference, though Clara had spent enough time around cruel men to know it. This face had seen difficulty and had not flinched away from it, and that had left marks. A scar along his jaw. Eyes that were a shade of gray she had never seen before. Not quite cold, not quite warm, somewhere in between, like the sky before a storm decides what it's going to do. He looked at her the way no one in Red Hollow had ever looked at her. Not like she was a problem, not like she was a burden. He looked at her like she was a person, which was so unexpected that it almost knocked the breath out of her body. Magistrate Holden was already seated at the table shuffling papers with the efficiency of a man who had performed distasteful tasks so many times that they no longer troubled him. He didn't look up when Clara entered. He addressed the room at large. "We are gathered here for the purpose of a legal marriage arrangement between Clara Whitmore Ward of Mrs. Vera Bloom and Caleb Stone, property owner of the Upper Stone Ridge claim." He said Ward the way some people said Stray. "The arrangement has been agreed upon by the Ward's guardian and by Mr. Stone's business associates, and satisfies the outstanding debt claim held against the Bloom household by Crowley Land and Cattle." There it was. Clara had known in some quiet, defeated part of herself that it would come to this eventually. Nathan Crowley had been calling in debts across Red Hollow for 2 years. He had taken the Miller farm. He had taken the blacksmith's tools and his livelihood with them. He had been circling Vera's property for months, and Vera, instead of finding another way, had found a faster one. She had offered Clara. Clara stood in the center of the room and breathed very carefully and did not let her hands shake. Magistrate Holden looked up from his papers and nodded toward Caleb Stone. "Mr. Stone, you've reviewed the terms." Caleb Stone had not stopped looking at Clara since she walked through the door. When Holden spoke, he didn't look at him immediately. He took a beat longer than was comfortable. Then he said in a voice that was low and even and completely without inflection, "I've reviewed them, and you agree to the terms as stated." There was a pause. It was the kind of pause that has weight to it. The kind that makes everyone in a room hold their breath without quite knowing why. Caleb Stone turned his gaze from Clara to the magistrate. "Before I agree to anything," he said, "I want to ask her something." Magistrate Holden blinked. "I beg your pardon. The woman." Caleb nodded once in Clara's direction. "I want to ask her something first." The room made a noise. Not quite a murmur, not quite a gasp, something in between. Deputy Hale, standing near the door, shifted his weight. Vera, seated in the back of the room with her hands folded tightly in her lap, went very still. Holden said slowly, "That is not the customary." "I didn't ask what was customary," Caleb said. He said it without heat, without aggression. He said it the way a man says something he means completely and has no intention of arguing about. The magistrate closed his mouth. Caleb Stone crossed the room. He moved unhurried, the way a man moves when he has spent years in the wilderness and has learned that panic serves no purpose and patience is the only currency that never runs out. He stopped in front of Clara and looked down at her. She was not a short woman, but he was considerably taller, and when he spoke, he kept his voice low enough that it was meant only for her. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She looked up at him. Up close, she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the kind that come from squinting into distance and wind. She could see that he was older than her by perhaps 15 years, and that his hands were the hands of a man who had worked in rough country for a long time. But she could also see, and this was the thing that she would remember for the rest of her life, that he was not looking at her the way men in this town looked at women they had already decided the worth of. "I was waiting. If you walk out that door right now," Caleb said, "I will not stop you. I will not send anyone after you. I will tell Holden the arrangement fell through and you are free to go wherever you choose." He paused. "That is the first thing I want you to know." Clara stared at him. Her voice, when she found it, was barely above a whisper. "And if I don't walk out, then I will take you back to Stone Ridge, and you will have your own room and your own space, and no one will tell you what to do with either of them." His jaw moved once. "That is the second thing." "Why?" Clara asked. It came out raw, unguarded in a way she hadn't intended. "Why would you give me the choice?" Something moved behind his eyes. Not softness exactly. Something more complicated than that. Something that had been hurt and had not healed all the way, and was very careful about showing itself. "Because somebody should have a long time ago," he said. The room behind them was utterly silent. No one in Red Hollow had ever heard Caleb Stone speak that many words in a row to anyone, and no one present could quite determine what had just happened, or what it meant, only that something had shifted in the room in a way that felt permanent. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the door. She looked at Vera in the back of the room, whose face had gone hard and closed off, because Vera had never liked uncertainty, and this was very uncertain indeed. She looked at the magistrate, who had the expression of a man watching a situation drift entirely outside his control. She looked back at Caleb Stone, and she said, "I'll stay." She didn't say it because she trusted him. She didn't say it because she believed him, not yet, not entirely. Not in the way you believe someone after you have seen who they are under pressure, instead of just under courtesy. She said it because the door led back to a life in Red Hollow, where she would be passed from hand to hand, until there were no hands left willing to take her. And because for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had stood in front of her and offered her something without asking for anything in return. She said it because it was the most choice she'd had in years. Magistrate Holden cleared his throat and shuffled his papers. "Well then," he said, "let us proceed." The ceremony lasted 11 minutes. Clara knew because she counted. There were no flowers, no guests who had come to celebrate, no music. Just the magistrate reading words from a document, 2 signatures on 2 lines, and the distant sound of the crowd outside, speculating about what was taking so long. When it was over, Caleb Stone offered her his arm to walk out. She didn't take it. Not yet. She wasn't ready for that. He didn't push. He simply walked beside her. When they came through the courthouse doors, and the crowd on the steps got their first look at the two of them together, the whispering started immediately. Clara heard it. "Thought she'd run. Doesn't look scared, does she? What's Stone doing? He never even looks at people." Caleb Stone heard it too. She could tell by the way his jaw set. But he didn't look at the crowd. He looked straight ahead, and that somehow made the crowd feel smaller. A man stepped forward from the left side of the steps. He was broad-shouldered and well-dressed, with the kind of self-satisfied authority that came from owning enough of a town that the town had forgotten it ever existed without him. Nathan Crowley. Clara recognized him. Everyone in Red Hollow recognized Nathan Crowley, the way they recognized bad weather, by the feeling that came before him. He stopped in front of Caleb with a wide, practiced smile. "Caleb," he said, "glad it all worked out. Knew you'd come around eventually." Caleb looked at him. "I didn't come around to anything," he said. "The debt is settled. We're done." Crowley's smile tightened at the corners. "Of course." He glanced at Clara with the kind of dismissive sweep that took in everything about her and valued none of it. "Good luck to you, miss." Clara met his gaze. She didn't smile. "Thank you," she said in a tone that made it clear she did not mean it. Something flickered in Crowley's eyes. Not respect, not yet, but awareness. The recognition that this woman was not going to be as manageable as advertised. He stepped back. Caleb's horse was tied at the post at the end of the street, along with a second smaller roan mare that Clara had not seen before. She stopped when she saw it. "Is that for you?" Caleb said. He untied both horses and handed her the roan's reins. "If you can ride." "I can ride," she said. "Good." He swung up onto his own horse with the easy efficiency of a man who had been on horseback most of his life. He didn't look back at the crowd. He didn't make a show of anything. He just sat up there in the afternoon sun and waited. Clara put her foot in the stirrup and pulled herself up. The blue dress was absolutely wrong for riding, and she knew she looked ridiculous, and she did not care even slightly, because she was leaving Red Hollow behind her on a horse that was hers, and that was more than she had walked in with. As they rode out of town, she heard Mrs. Aldrich call out from the boardwalk, sharp and carrying. "She won't last 6 months up on that mountain." Clara did not look back, but behind her she heard Caleb Stone say quietly to no one in particular, "She'll last a lot longer than that." The ride out of Red Hollow took most of the afternoon. The mountain road climbed quickly from the flat valley floor into the pines, and the heat that had been suffocating down in the town began to ease as they gained elevation. Clara had been up in the foothills before on foot foraging in the summers when Vera's pantry ran low, but she had never been this far. The road thinned to a trail, and the trail wound between stands of old-growth pines so thick the light came through in pieces. Caleb rode ahead of her. Not far ahead, close enough that she could see him, close enough that if something had gone wrong with her horse or the trail, he would have known. But far enough that she understood he was not going to crowd her. He had not said another word since the edge of town. Clara had 100 questions and no idea which one to ask first, so she asked none of them. She watched the back of his shoulders. She watched how he moved on horseback, loose, completely at ease, the reins held light in one hand. She watched how he read the trail ahead of them, his eyes moving constantly without urgency, the way someone reads a familiar text. After an hour of silence, she said, "How long have you lived up here?" He glanced back over his shoulder. 12 years. Alone. A pause. Yes. "You don't seem like a man who makes arrangements with people like Nathan Crowley," she said. It came out more direct than she'd intended, but something about the altitude and the distance from Red Hollow was making her braver than she usually allowed herself to be. Caleb was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "I'm not. This was a one-time thing." "On account of the debt." "On account of the debt," he agreed. "And on account of—" He stopped. He seemed to be measuring something. "Word reached me about your situation. Some months back. There's a man in town, Hector Reyes, runs the feed store. He told me what Crowley was planning." Clara frowned. Hector knew. "He worried," Caleb said. "Said there wasn't anyone looking out for you." He paused again. He was right. Clara absorbed that quietly. She had known Hector Reyes her whole life. He had always been kind to her in the small, careful ways that people in impossible situations are kind, an extra measure of flour. A word of encouragement, never looking at her the way the rest of the town did. She had not known he had gone to anyone on her behalf. She felt something tighten in her throat that she refused to let become anything more than that. "So you agreed," she said, "to the arrangement." "I agreed to meet with Crowley," Caleb said. "I agreed to settle the debt. What happened this morning, the way he handled it, the crowd, all of it, that was his version of the arrangement, not mine." Clara stared at the back of his head. "What was your version?" He turned then enough that she could see his profile against the tree line. "I wanted to give you the choice. That was all. And if I had left, then I would have given Vera the money directly and told Crowley the deal was off and dealt with whatever came after." His voice was level, matter of fact, the way someone describes something they have already thought all the way through. "It would have cost me more, but that wasn't your problem to solve." Clara was quiet for a long moment. The trail curved around a rocky outcropping, and when they came around the other side, the valley opened up below them in a wide sweep of green and gold, and Clara could see the shape of the mountains against the sky in every direction, clean and enormous and indifferent to everything that happened in the small human world beneath them. She hadn't expected it to be beautiful. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Not accusatory, honest. "In return, there must be something." Caleb shook his head. "There's work to be done on the property. If you want to help with it, I won't turn down the help. If you don't, I'll manage." He looked at her steadily. "I don't need anything from you, Miss Whitmore. I want that to be clear before we get there." "Clara," she said. He blinked. "My name is Clara," she said. "Not Miss Whitmore. I've been Miss Whitmore all my life, and it has never once made anything better." Something moved in his face. It might have been the beginning of something like amusement, though it was hard to be certain. "Clara," he said. The ranch appeared around the next bend in the trail, and it was not what she had expected. She had expected rough, maybe even squalid, the wilderness home of a man who had lived alone for 12 years without anyone to answer to. What she found was a solid squared-off log house with a stone chimney, a barn off to the left, a well and a garden plot to the right, and a corral where 3 horses lifted their heads when the riders came through the gate. It was not soft, but it was clean. It was cared for, and it was considerably larger than it needed to be for one person. She noticed that. She filed it away. Caleb dismounted and took both horses to the barn without a word. Clara stood in the yard and looked at the house, and at the mountains behind it, and at the sky above, which was turning the particular shade of amber that comes just before the last of the light goes. She had arrived, she thought. She had no idea what that meant yet. She had no idea what kind of life this was going to be, or what kind of man Caleb Stone would prove to be once courtesy gave way to dailiness. But she was not in Red Hollow, and someone had given her a choice. She carried herself up the steps and through the front door to see what waited on the other side. The inside of the house was one large room divided by use rather than by walls, a table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, a cot built into the left wall, shelves of dried goods and tools, a second door at the back that was closed. It smelled of wood smoke and pine resin, and faintly of coffee. Sitting on the table was a tin cup, a folded blanket, and a piece of paper with writing on it. She crossed the room and picked up the paper. "The back room is yours. The door has a bolt on the inside. Your horse is yours to come and go as you need. No one here will tell you what to do or where to be." C.S. Clara read it twice. She set it down. She picked up the blanket, which was heavy wool and smelled clean, and she went to the back door and opened it. The room behind it was small and plain. A bed. A window that looked out at the mountain's eastern face. A hook on the wall. Not much, but enough. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She was 19 years old, and she had been married that morning to a stranger, and she was in a cabin on a mountain in Montana, and she had no idea what her life was going to become. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not afraid. She did not sleep well that first night, not because the bed was uncomfortable. It was the best bed she had slept in since her mother died, but because her mind refused to stop working. It kept pulling her back to the courthouse, to Caleb's voice, to the paper on the table with its plain, careful handwriting. The door has a bolt on the inside. She had bolted it. Not because she was afraid of him exactly, but because she had spent so many years with no door she could lock, that the simple act of throwing that bolt felt like something enormous, like staking a claim on herself. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the sounds of the mountain wind in the pines, something moving far off in the trees, the occasional creak of the house settling, and she thought about what Hector Reyes had done. Going to a man he barely knew. Asking for help for a girl the rest of the town had already written off. She had not known. She had spent years believing that nobody in Red Hollow saw her, and it turned out at least one person had seen her clearly enough to act on it, and she had never once suspected. That was the thing about loneliness that nobody told you. It could make you blind to the small kindnesses that existed right beside it. She was up before dawn. Old habit. Vera had run a tight household, and sleeping past first light had never been an option. Clara dressed quickly in the dark, unbolted the door, and stepped out into the main room. Caleb was already there. He was seated at the table with a cup of coffee, a worn ledger book open in front of him. He did not look up when she came in, but he said without any preamble, "Coffee's on the stove." She poured a cup and stood near the fireplace and drank it. It was strong. Stronger than anything she'd had in years. Vera had always watered hers down to stretch the supply. "There's bread in the cloth on the shelf," he said, still without looking up. "And eggs if you want them. Chickens are in the coop to the left of the barn." "I know how to get eggs," Clara said. "I know you do," he said. "I'm just telling you where they are." She went and got the eggs. She came back in and found a pan and cooked them over the fire, and she made enough for 2 without thinking about it. And when she set a plate beside his ledger, He looked up then briefly with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I made enough," she said. "It's not a statement." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and picked up a fork. They ate in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence. That surprised her. She had expected any number of things from this man. Severity demands the slow revelation of expectations she had not been warned about. What she got instead was simply a person eating breakfast across a table from her turning pages in a ledger, occasionally writing something in the margin with a short, blunt pencil. After a while she said, "What's the ledger?" "Property records," he said. "Fence lines, water claims, timber rights." He paused. "Crowley has been pushing on my eastern boundary for 2 seasons. I'm documenting everything." Clara looked at the ledger. "He wants your land." "He wants all the land," Caleb said. "Mine is just next on the list." She absorbed that. "Is that why he set up the debt arrangement with Vera?" Caleb set the pencil down. He looked at her directly, and she recognized by now that this was not something he did casually. When Caleb Stone looked at you straight on, it meant he was about to say something he had decided was worth saying. "Partly," he said. "He needed me obligated to him. He figured a man with a wife and a debt is easier to pressure than a man with neither." A pause. "He miscalculated." "On which part?" "Both," he said. Clara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and looked at the fire. "He's going to cause trouble." "He always causes trouble," Caleb said. "That's the only thing he knows how to do well." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "What do you need done today?" He blinked. It was a small movement, barely visible, but she caught it. She was already learning to read the small movements. "The east fence line needs checking," he said. 3 miles of it. I've been meaning to get to it for a week. I can ride that with you." "It's rough country." "I said I can ride." He looked at her for a moment with that measuring expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of reconsidering something. Then he said, "We leave in an hour." The fence line took the better part of the day, and by the time they came back down the eastern ridge, as the afternoon shadows stretched long across the mountain, Clara understood several things she had not understood that morning. She understood that the land Caleb was protecting was not just property. It was a living thing he had spent 12 years building into something, the water system he had dug himself. The meadow he had cleared and seeded, the stands of timber he had managed carefully enough that they would still be standing in 100 years. She understood writing that line that she was looking at 12 years of a man's life. She understood also that he was good company. Not in the way of a man who fills silences with noise, in the way of a man who says the right thing at the right moment and otherwise lets the world speak for itself. At the furthest point of the eastern fence, they found 3 posts pulled clean out of the ground. Caleb dismounted and crouched down beside the nearest post. He examined the ground around it without touching anything for a long moment. "Pulled," he said. "Not rotted, not knocked by an animal." He looked up at her. "Somebody came up here and did this by hand." Clara's stomach tightened. "Crowley. His men." Caleb stood. His voice hadn't changed, still level, still even, but something had gone hard behind his eyes. "He's testing how fast I notice." "And how fast do you—" "Fast enough," he said. He reset the posts himself, driving them back into the ground with a force that said more about his state of mind than his face did. And Clara held the fence wire taut while he worked and did not comment on any of it. And when they were done, they rode back in the long last light of afternoon, and neither of them spoke for a while. Then Clara said, "He's going to keep doing it." "Yes. And there's only one of you." Caleb glanced at her. "There are 2 of us now," he said. It was said plainly, without sentiment, as a simple statement of fact. But it landed in Clara's chest with a weight she hadn't expected, and she spent the rest of the ride back, turning it over in her mind, examining it from different angles, trying to understand why it felt so different from every other time in her life, when she had technically been counted among a number of people. That night after supper, she found him on the porch. He was sitting on the top step with a cup of coffee cooling in his hands, looking out at the dark shape of the mountains against a sky full of stars. She came out and sat on the step beside him, leaving a careful foot of space between them, and for a while they just sat there. She said eventually, "In town, before we left, I heard Mrs. Aldrich." "I heard her too." "You said I'd last longer than 6 months." "You will," he said. "You don't know that." He turned to look at her. "I know more about what a person's made of than most people do," he said. "You walked into that courthouse this morning, and you didn't flinch once. You rode a rough fence line all day in a dress that wasn't built for it. You held the wire without being asked." A pause. "I know what I'm looking at." Clara didn't answer right away. She looked at the stars. "My mother used to say that a person's worth isn't what other people assign them," she said. "She died when I was 11. I spent the next 8 years wondering if she was right about anything at all, because the people she left me with saw me as something to be managed." She stopped. "I stopped saying that out loud a long time ago. Nobody in Red Hollow wanted to hear it." Caleb was quiet. Then, "Your mother was right." "You don't know what she was." "No," he said, "but she was right about that." Clara looked at him. The firelight from the window was behind them, and she could see his profile in the starlight, the scar on his jaw, the hard set of his mouth that was not unkindness, but something more complicated, something learned. "You have scars," she said. "Not just the one on your face." He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes." "Are you going to tell me about them?" "Not tonight," he said. "But I'll tell you eventually, if you want to know." "I want to know," she said. "Then you'll know," he said. He took the coffee cup and went back inside. At the door he stopped. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's a long day." She stayed on the steps a little longer after he went in. She looked at the stars until the cold began to seep through the blue dress she still hadn't changed out of, and then she went inside and bolted the door to her room. And this time, when she lay in the dark, she was not only thinking. She was also, for the first time in a very long time, something close to quiet. She had been on Stone Ridge for 9 days when the first person from Red Hollow came up the mountain. She recognized the horse before she recognized the rider. A bay gelding with a white blaze that belonged to Thomas Aldrich, the seamstress's son, who ran errands for half the town and was generally harmless but had a loose mouth and an instinct for carrying information to whoever wanted it most. Caleb was in the barn. Clara was at the garden plot, which she had spent the past 3 days turning back into something functional after years of minimal attention. She stood up when she heard hoofbeats, and she did not move toward the gate. Thomas Aldrich pulled up short when he saw her. He had plainly expected something different. An empty yard, maybe. Or a version of Clara that was diminished, defeated, confirming whatever theory he'd ridden up here with. "Miss Whitmore," he said before catching himself. "Mrs. Stone." "Thomas," she said. He looked around the yard. "Caleb about—" "He's busy," she said. "Can I help you with something?" Thomas shifted in the saddle. He had a rolled piece of paper in his coat pocket, which he produced with a slightly too casual movement that Clara recognized immediately as the movement of a person who had been told to deliver something and instructed on how to act when he did it. "Got a message for Stone, from Mr. Crowley's office." "You can leave it with me," Clara said. Thomas hesitated. "It's addressed to Stone directly." "And I'm his wife," Clara said. "Leave it with me." Another hesitation. Then Thomas handed it over. The way a man hands something over, when he knows arguing will only make him look worse, and he turned his horse and headed back down the trail without another word. Clara waited until she could no longer hear hoofbeats before she unrolled the paper. It was a legal notice. Formal language, official letterhead, Crowley's attorney's name across the top. It cited a water rights dispute on the eastern boundary, and demanded in the polished way that legal documents demand things that Caleb Stone appear before a land arbitration committee in Red Hollow within 14 days to answer the claim. She was still reading it when Caleb came out of the barn. He crossed the yard to her, and she handed him the paper without a word. He read it once. He read it again. His face did not change. "Water rights," he said. "That's what it says. He doesn't have a claim on the water. The spring on the eastern edge has been part of this property since before Crowley ever set foot in this county." He folded the paper in half. "He knows that. This is paper. Paper filed with the right people to make enough noise that it looks like a real dispute. "What do you do with paper?" Clara asked. "You answer it with better paper," he said. "And a lawyer who knows the land records back further than Crowley does." "Do you have one?" "Not yet." He looked at her. "But I know who I need to talk to." He went back to Red Hollow 2 days later, which was the first time Clara had been alone on the property for any significant stretch. He left early and didn't come back until well after dark, and the hours in between were the longest she had spent since arriving on the mountain. Not because she was afraid of being alone. She'd been alone most of her life one way or another. But because she noticed in his absence how much space he occupied without trying to. The yard was quieter. The house felt like a different shape. She moved through the day doing the things that needed doing. The garden, the chickens' water from the well. And she thought about what it meant that she noticed his absence. She was on the porch with a lamp when he came back. He saw her sitting there, and his step slowed for just a moment. She caught it before he came up to the porch and sat down heavily on the top step. "Well," she said. "I found a lawyer," he said. "Amos Krell. He's been practicing in Billings for 30 years. He knows every land claim in this part of Montana." He paused. "He also told me that Crowley has been in contact with the Territorial Land Office. He's trying to get a review of the original Stone Ridge survey." Clara felt her stomach drop. "On what grounds?" "Clerical error," Caleb said. 30-year-old surveyor's notation that Crowley claims marked the boundary 600 yards east of where it stands. That would put Spring inside his claim. "Yes." "Is the claim real?" "No," he said flatly. "The notation was a filing issue. The actual survey markers are still in the ground. I know where every single one of them is." He looked at her. "But a land review takes time, and while it's pending, Crowley can make enough noise to cast doubt on the whole eastern boundary." "He's not trying to win legally," Clara said. "He's trying to wear you down." Caleb looked at her with something that was, she realized, respect. "No," he said. "He isn't." "Then you don't let him," she said. "You document everything. Every post he pulls, every paper he files, every man he sends up this mountain. You build a record he can't argue with." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You sound like a lawyer." "I sound like someone who grew up watching people use paperwork as a weapon," she said. "Crowley used it on Vera's debt, on the Miller farm. He has a pattern, and patterns leave tracks." He studied her in the lamplight for a long beat. "Where did you learn to think like that?" "I had a lot of time, and not much else to work with," she said. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I went by Hector's store." Clara stilled. "Told him you were well," Caleb said. "He wanted to know." She looked at the lamp for a moment. Something in her throat went tight again, the same way it had on the mountain when she first learned what Hector had done. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "He's a good man," Caleb said. "Not enough of those in Red Hollow." "No," she agreed. "There aren't." The silence between them stretched, but it was a comfortable silence by now, and she noticed that too, how quickly comfortable had arrived when her whole life it had been so scarce. Then Caleb said quietly, and without looking at her, "People were talking." She waited. "About you," he said. "In town. I heard it when I was coming out of Krell's office. 2 women on the boardwalk, saying—" He stopped, started again. "Saying you'd trapped me. That you'd been chasing my land from the beginning. That the whole thing was arranged by you and Vera together." Clara closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them. "Of course they were." "I wanted you to hear it from me," he said, "before someone else found a way to get it to you. And does it—" She stopped, recalibrated. "Do you believe any of it?" He turned and looked at her with an expression so flat and certain that it almost startled her. "No," he said. "I don't." She exhaled. "All right." "But you need to know it's out there," he said, "because it won't stop, and I'd rather you be ready for it than blindsided." She nodded. She was already turning it over, thinking about what it would mean when it escalated, and it would escalate because it always did, because people who wanted to push someone out found every angle that was available to them, and pushed on all of them simultaneously. "Let them talk," she said finally. "I've been the subject of Red Hollow's talk my whole life. I know how to outlast it." He looked at her for a long, still moment. Then something in his face shifted, not much barely visible, and he said, "Good." It was 2 mornings after that when Clara went into the barn to feed the horses and found Caleb sitting on the ground in the far corner back against the wall, his hands between his knees looking at nothing. She stopped in the doorway. She had seen a lot of versions of a person sitting like that, and she recognized this one. It was not sickness. It was not anger. It was the particular way a person sits when something heavy has come back up to the surface, and they are waiting very still for it to pass. She did not say anything right away. She went to the first stall and filled the feed trough the way she had every morning for 9 days, and moved on to the second, and she let the sounds of the barn do what they do. The horses shifting the hay, rustling the small ordinary noises that exist completely outside of human trouble. When she got to the third stall, the one closest to where he was sitting, she said without looking at him, "You don't have to talk." A pause. "I know. But if you want to," she said, "I'm not going anywhere." Another pause longer. "My wife," he said. "My first one. We don't have to. I'm not asking you to care about this." "I'm already listening," she said. She filled the third trough and leaned on the stall rail with her back to him, which she had learned was sometimes the easier angle for things that were hard to say to someone's face. I was quiet for a moment. Her name was Rose. She died 7 years ago, in the winter. Fever. A pause that had weight in it. I was 3 days right away when it happened. Didn't know until I got back. Clara stayed very still. "I came back and the house was empty, and she was already buried," he said. His voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of something that had been held under pressure for a very long time. "I didn't leave this mountain for 2 years after that." "Is that why you live alone?" Clara asked. "Partly," he said. "And partly because I thought—" He stopped. "I thought being alone meant I couldn't lose anything else." Clara turned then slowly and looked at him. He was still looking at the ground between his hands. "That's not how loss works," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't. You've been carrying that up here by yourself for 7 years. He looked up at her then. His face was not broken. This man did not break easily. She already understood that about him. But it was open in a way she suspected very few people ever saw it. "I told Hector once," he said. "That's the only other person who knows." Clara held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for telling me." He nodded once. He stood up with the deliberate movement of a man gathering himself back into the shape the day needed him to take, and he picked up the feed scoop and finished the last 2 stalls himself without another word. But as he passed her on his way back toward the barn door, he stopped. He didn't face her fully. He looked forward, and she looked at the side of his face. "I want you to know something," he said. "All right. I'm not carrying this alone anymore," he said. I want you to understand, that's not nothing to me." He walked out into the morning before she could answer. Clara stood in the barn with the smell of hay and horses around her, and the sounds of the mountain coming in through the open door, and she thought that there was something happening here that she had no previous experience to prepare her for. Not rescue. She did not need rescue. Not dependence. She did not want to be dependent. Something else. Something that she did not have a clean word for yet, but that lived in the space between 2 people who had both been alone in the particular way that comes from being unseen, and who were very carefully and very slowly beginning to see each other. She straightened her shoulders. She picked up the empty water bucket. She went out to start the day. She was 3 weeks in when Red Hollow stopped being a distant problem and started being a present one. She had ridden down to the base of the mountain to collect the mail, a task Caleb had added to her routine without ceremony, simply by telling her the pickup schedule and handing her the saddlebag, and she was coming back up the lower trail when she heard riders behind her, 2 of them coming fast. She did not stop. She kept her horse at the same pace and listened to the sound of them closing behind her. The first one drew up alongside her. He was a young man she didn't recognize, wide in the shoulders, wearing a vest with Crowley's cattle brand stitched on the pocket. He grinned at her with the particular grin of a man who has been told he can get away with something. "Mrs. Stone," he said, drawing the name out like it was something funny. Clara kept writing. "Mr. Crowley sends his regards," the young man said. "He wanted me to pass on a friendly suggestion, that a woman living up on Stone Ridge all that way from town, it ain't natural, ain't safe either." He paused. "People have accidents up on this mountain all the time." Clara stopped her horse. She turned and looked at him with a steadiness that she had spent 19 years developing, and she said in a voice that could have cut glass, "Is that a threat?" The young man's grin held, but something shifted behind his eyes. He hadn't expected that tone. He'd expected fear. "Just a friendly observation," he said. "Then observe this," Clara said. "Caleb Stone has been in this county for 12 years, and Nathan Crowley has been circling him for 2, and the mountain is still Caleb's. Whatever Crowley told you to do up here, you should ask yourself how it went for the last person he sent up." She turned her horse back toward the trail. "And tell your employer that I've been noting dates and descriptions. Every incident, every visit, every pulled fence post." She looked back at him over her shoulder. Paper cuts both ways. She rode up the mountain without looking back. Her hands did not shake until she was through the gate. She was in the yard, unsaddling her horse, breathing carefully through her nose, when Caleb came out of the house. He looked at her face and read it instantly. "What happened?" she told him, straight through without embellishment. When she finished, his face was very still. Not the stillness of a man who is calm. The stillness of a man who is controlling something with considerable effort. "2 of them," he said. "Yes." "Crowley's brand on the vest?" "Yes." He was quiet for 5 full seconds. Clara counted. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. And then, because it was true, I wasn't afraid of them. Something moved across his face that she was starting to learn to read. It was the thing that happened when she did something that surprised him in a way he hadn't prepared himself for. He didn't let it stay on his face long, but it was there. "I know you weren't," he said. "I told them I've been keeping records," she said. "I hope that was exactly right," he said. He said it with a certainty that landed like a hand on her shoulder, though he hadn't moved from where he was standing. "That was exactly the right thing." She nodded. She finished unsaddling the roan and led her into the stall. When she came back out, Caleb was still standing in the yard, looking out toward the eastern boundary, with his jaw set and his eyes somewhere distant. "He's escalating," she said. "Yes." "He's going to do something bigger." Caleb turned and looked at her. "Yes," he said again. "He is." A pause. "And when he does, we'll be ready." She looked at him standing there in the yard of the property he had built over 12 years of his life, the property that held everything he had made in the world. And she thought about the man who had pulled fence posts in the dark and sent young men with threats up a mountain trail. And she thought about what Caleb had said in the barn, about not being alone anymore. She said quietly, "Then let's get ready." And Caleb Stone, for the first time since Clara Whitmore had arrived on his mountain, looked at her and allowed something that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to change the shape of his face entirely. It was not a comfortable thing, Nathan Crowley's attention. It pressed on everything quiet and constant and relentless, the way water presses on a dam. But Clara Whitmore had grown up under pressure, and she had learned in 3 weeks on Stone Ridge that she was not the only one here who knew how to hold. The letter from Amos Krell arrived on a Thursday morning, and it changed everything. Clara had been the one to ride down for the mail, same as every week, and she had read the first 2 lines standing right there at the postbox, with the summer heat pressing down on the back of her neck, and then she had folded it back up, put it in the saddlebag, and ridden back up the mountain faster than she had ever ridden anything in her life. Caleb was splitting wood in the yard when she came through the gate at a pace that brought him around immediately, axe still in hand. "Krell wrote," she said, pulling the letter out before she had even dismounted fully. He took it, read it, standing there. His face did the thing it did when the news was bad. Not a flinch, not a visible reaction, just a quality of stillness that went half a degree colder than his usual stillness. He read it twice. Then he said he found the notation. The clerical error Crowley's been using. Yes. Caleb folded the letter. Except Krell says it isn't a clerical error. The original surveyor made 2 sets of notations. The one Crowley filed with the territorial office is the preliminary. The final survey, the one that legally establishes the boundary, was recorded separately, in the county clerk's office in Billings. He looked at her. Crowley either doesn't know about the second document, or he's betting that nobody else does. Which is it? Doesn't matter, Caleb said. Either way, Krell can pull the final survey and file it as a counter-record before the Land Review Board convenes. He paused. But there's a problem. Clara waited. The review board meets in 3 weeks, he said. Krell needs to travel to Billings, locate the record, have it certified, and file it with the board before the hearing date. That's a tight window. Another pause. And Crowley has a man on the board, Judge Farrow. He's been in Crowley's pocket for 4 years. Can Krell get around him? If the document is certified and filed correctly, Farrow can't suppress it without exposing himself, Caleb said. But Crowley will know what's coming the minute Krell files. And knowing Crowley. He won't wait for the hearing, Clara finished. Caleb looked at her. No, he won't. They stood in the yard in the heat of the morning, and the weight of what came next settled over both of them with the particular gravity of a situation that has stopped being about paperwork and started being about something more immediate. Clara said, "We have 3 weeks." Yes. Then we use them. She had meant it practically. What she did not anticipate was how much those 3 weeks would reveal about Crowley, about the mountain, and about the 2 people who were living on it. The first thing she did was write down everything. Every incident since her arrival, dated and described in plain language. The pulled fence posts, the riders on the trail, the legal notice, the threatening visit. She filled 12 pages in a ledger she had found on Caleb's shelf, and when she was done, she made a second copy and gave it to Caleb to add his own observations. He sat at the table that evening, reading what she had written, and he was quiet for a long time. "You remembered all of this exactly," he said. "I've been keeping it in my head since the day the riders came up the trail," she said. "I just hadn't written it down yet." He set the ledger down. He looked at her across the table in a way that she was beginning to understand meant he was revising something, not his opinion of her exactly, but his understanding of the scope of it. Like he had measured a room and found it considerably larger than the walls had suggested. "You're good at this," he said. "I've been underestimated my whole life," she said. "I paid attention to things people didn't think I was watching. It adds up." He nodded slowly. Then he said without changing tone, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "There's a man in Red Hollow," he said. "Works as a clerk in the land office. His name is Gerald Webb. Crowley has been paying him for information, who files what, who asks about which properties, which records are being pulled. Krell told me." He paused. "Which means the moment Krell requests the Billings record, Webb may find out and pass it to Crowley." Clara's mind was already working through the shape of it. Can Krell request it through a different channel without going through the local office? "He's already thinking about it," Caleb said. "But there's no guarantee. So Crowley might know what we're doing before we do it." "Might already know," Caleb said. "Which is why I want you to be careful when you go down the mountain. Take a different route back. Don't use the main trail alone." She met his eyes. "You're worried." "I'm practical," he said. "Caleb." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, I'm worried." It was the first time he had said her name without any qualifier attached to it. No, Miss Whitmore, no steady-voiced distance. Just her name, and under it something that was honest and unguarded in a way that cost him something to let out. "I'll be careful," she said, "but I'm not going to stop." He held her gaze. "I know you won't." 6 days later, Clara went down to Hector Reyes's feed store. She hadn't planned to go inside. She had told herself she was only picking up a supply order Caleb had placed the week before. But Hector was at the counter when she came in, and when he looked up and saw her, the relief on his face was so complete and so unguarded that it knocked something loose in her chest that she had been keeping held carefully in place. "Clara," he said. Just that. Hector, she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. He came around the counter and stood in front of her and looked at her. The way a man looks at someone he genuinely thought he might not see again, checking that she was real and present and undamaged. And Clara found that she could not immediately say anything useful because her throat had gone tight in a way she couldn't argue with. "You look well," he said. "You look better than I expected, which I'm ashamed to say, because I should have expected better." "You went to him," she said. "You went to Caleb." "Somebody had to," Hector said, with the particular simplicity of a good person who has done a good thing and sees no reason to make more of it than it is. "There was nobody else who was going to." "I didn't know," she said. "I didn't know anyone saw what was happening." "I saw," he said. "I always saw. I just didn't know what to do about it until I thought of Caleb." He paused. Is he treating you right?" She thought of the note on the table, the bolt on the inside of the door, the 2 mornings of coffee before questions, the way he had said, "I'm not carrying this alone anymore," and walked out before she could respond. "Yes," she said. "He is." Hector let out a breath. "Good man," he said. "Always known it. Everybody in this town has him wrong." She gathered the supply order, and she was almost to the door when Hector said quietly, "Clara, Crowley was in here 2 days ago. He asked about you." She turned. "What did he ask?" "Whether you'd been in. Whether you seemed settled or restless." Hector's jaw set. "I told him I hadn't seen you. He knew I was lying. He smiled about it." A beat. "That man's smile is the ugliest thing in this county." "What else?" she said. "He said, and I want you to hear this from me before you hear it. Some other way, he said that a woman who married into a land dispute was going to find herself on the wrong side of it." Hector looked at her steadily. He meant it as a threat. "I want you to know I don't think it's an empty one." Clara nodded. She kept her breathing even. "Thank you, Hector. You watch yourself," he said. "And you tell Caleb Stone that Hector Reyes says hello, and that if he needs anything from this store, it's his at cost, any time." She carried that back up the mountain and set it down in front of Caleb that evening without preamble. "Crowley came to Hector," she said. "He's watching my movements." Caleb did not look surprised. He looked settled in a way that meant he had already considered this possibility and had been waiting for the confirmation. "What did he say to Hector?" "That I'd find myself on the wrong side of the land dispute." She sat down across from him. "He's not just going after the property anymore. He's trying to isolate us, make us look like a problem the town should want resolved." "He's done it before," Caleb said. "It's how he took the Miller farm, made it look like Len Miller was the troublemaker, not him." By the time the county got involved, most of Red Hollow was on Crowley's side. "Then we don't let him write that story," Clara said. Caleb looked at her. "How?" "We don't stay on this mountain," she said. "We go to town. We let people see us. We talk to people, not about the dispute about ordinary things. We become people they know instead of people they've only heard about." She leaned forward slightly. "Crowley wins by making us into rumors. You can't make a rumor out of someone you've talked to face to face." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He was not a man who enjoyed Red Hollow. She knew that. She knew the town and the crowds and the careful navigation of other people's opinions was something he had left behind by choice, not by accident. But he said when, "Saturday," she said. "The market." He nodded once. "Saturday." The Red Hollow Summer Market was held in the square every 3rd Saturday, and it drew most of the valley, which meant that when Caleb Stone walked into it beside Clara Whitmore on a bright July morning, there was not a single person present who did not notice. Clara felt the attention like weather. She had felt it her whole life, but it had a different quality now. Before, the looks had been the looks people give something they pity or dismiss. Now they were something more complicated, uncertain, recalibrating, trying to determine what to make of a situation they had already decided on and were now being forced to revise. Caleb walked beside her with his hat level and his shoulders straight and his face wearing its usual expression of absolute equanimity, and he nodded at people when they looked at him, which was something Clara suspected he did not typically bother to do. The first person to speak to them was Margaret Delaney, who ran the dry goods stall and had 3 daughters and a practical streak a mile wide. She had known Clara since childhood, not warmly, but not unkindly. Either the way a woman knows a neighbor's child, she doesn't have strong feelings about. She looked at the two of them approaching and made a rapid calculation that was visible on her face, and then she said, "Clara, you're looking well." "Margaret," Clara said. "How are the girls?" "Growing too fast," Margaret said. She glanced at Caleb with a look that was carefully neutral. "Mr. Stone." "Mrs. Delaney," Caleb said. He removed his hat briefly, which was such an unexpected gesture that Margaret blinked. "I hear you're up on the ridge," Margaret said to Clara, in the tone of a woman gathering information she considers herself entitled to. "We are," Clara said. "Lot of land up there." "Enough," Clara said. "The garden's coming along. I've been expanding it." She said it easily, like a woman talking about her home, because it was her, and she had decided that morning on the way down the mountain that she was going to speak about it that way, and let that framing sit in people's ears until it became the natural one. Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in her expression. Some calculation completed, some verdict revised. "If you need seed stock for the late planting, I have extra. Better price than the feed store." "I'd appreciate that," Clara said. They moved on through the market, and the pattern repeated itself with small variations. Some people were warm. Some were awkward, trying to reconcile the story they had built about Clara Whitmore with the woman standing in front of them, who was clearly not performing distress. Some were pointedly absent. She noticed the Aldrich women on the far side of the square watching, but not approaching. And then Nathan Crowley appeared. He came from the direction of the bank, which he part-owned, wearing his good coat, despite the heat, and he moved through the market with the ease of a man who believes the space he occupies belongs to him by right. He saw Clara and Caleb from 20 feet away, and did not change his pace or his expression, which told Clara that this was not accidental. He had known they would be here. He stopped in front of them. "Caleb," he said. "Didn't expect to see you down from the mountain." "Here I am," Caleb said. His voice was level. His hands were still. Crowley's eyes moved to Clara with the same dismissive sweep she remembered from the courthouse steps, but there was something else in it now. An assessment. A man recalculating. "Mrs. Stone, how are you finding mountain life?" "Very well," Clara said. "I've been expanding the garden. The eastern meadow has good soil." Something moved in Crowley's eyes at the word eastern. She had put it there deliberately. "Glad to hear it," he said, and his voice was still smooth, still pleasant. "Though I imagine it can be uncertain. Living up there, so far from town, so much that can go wrong." He let that sit for exactly one beat. Property disputes, survey disagreements, the kind of legal complications that can drag on for years. "Legal complications get resolved with documentation," Caleb said. "Which I have." "Do you?" Crowley said. "Because from what I understand, the boundary question is still open." "The final survey record is not open," Caleb said. "Amos Krell has located it." The change in Crowley's face was small. A micro-shift in the muscles around his jaw. A half-second of something that was not quite surprise, but was close enough to it. He recovered immediately, but Clara had watched for it, and she had caught it. He hadn't known about the second document. Or he had known, and he had gambled that Krell wouldn't find it in time. "Well," Crowley said with a smile that had gone slightly thinner, "I'm sure the board will evaluate everything thoroughly." "I'm counting on it," Caleb said. Crowley looked at Clara one more time, a long, measuring look that was meant to be unsettling, and that she met without blinking, and then he turned and walked away through the market the same way he had come. Clara waited until he was out of earshot. Then she said quietly, "He didn't know about the final survey." "No," Caleb said. "He didn't. Which means his whole case at the review board just collapsed." "Which means," Caleb said in the same quiet voice, "he's going to try something before the board convenes." She looked at him. "How long do we have?" "Days," he said. "Maybe less." They rode back up the mountain that afternoon, in a silence that was not comfortable because it was occupied by the specific weight of knowing something is coming, and not knowing precisely what shape it will take when it arrives. Clara was turning it over and over in her mind, the micro-shift in Crowley's jaw, the thinning of his smile, the particular quality of a man who has just discovered that his plan has a gap in it and is already working around to the alternative. A man like Crowley did not have only one plan. She said it aloud when they were halfway up. He has a contingency. Caleb didn't look back. Yes. The legal case was the clean version. The contingency won't be clean. No. Then we needed to be ready for something we can't document, she said. Something that happens fast in the dark where paperwork doesn't help. He pulled his horse to a stop on the trail and turned in the saddle to look at her fully. It was not a long look, but it was a complete one, the kind that takes in everything available. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking he comes for something he can't get in court," she said. "The spring, the barn, something he can damage faster than you can recover." She met his eyes. "I'm thinking we don't sleep easy for the next week." He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "No, we don't." They got back to the property as the sun was dropping toward the western ridge, and Caleb immediately walked the perimeter of the fence line that bordered the barn and the water system, checking connections and gate latches, while Clara went inside and started water boiling for supper. She set the table and put plates on it and was cutting bread when she heard him come in. He stopped inside the store. He looked at the table, at the plates, at the scene of ordinary domesticity that had assembled itself over the past 3 weeks through the accumulation of small daily choices, and something moved across his face that she had not seen there before. She kept cutting bread. "What?" "Nothing," he said. He hung his hat on the hook by the door. He washed his hands at the basin. He sat down. "You can say it," she said. I was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking that this house is different than it was a month ago." "Better or worse?" He looked at her steadily. "Clara." She set the bread knife down. She looked at him. "It's considerably better," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "For me too," and turned back to supper, because some things you say once and don't need to say again, and this was one of those things. The fire came at 3 in the morning. Clara woke to the smell of it before she heard anything smoke threading under the door, carrying the particular sharpness of burning wood that is not a hearth fire, not a controlled thing, something that has gotten out and means to stay out. She was out of bed before she was fully awake, and she had the door open before she registered that Caleb was already in the main room, already pulling his boots on, already moving. "The barn," he said. His voice was hard and absolutely certain. She grabbed her boots. She didn't stop to think about anything except keeping up with him. Outside the barn was lit orange along the roofline and the south wall. Not fully engulfed, not yet, but going. The heat was intense, pressing at them from 30 feet away, and inside she could hear the horses screaming. The particular sound of an animal who understands danger with absolute clarity and wants to tell every creature in range about it. Caleb was already at the barn door. "The horses," she said. "I know." He had the latch up. The door swung open and the heat came out like all wall. He went in without stopping. Clara went in behind him. Inside, the smoke was thick enough that she dropped automatically to a crouch, moving fast, going to the first stall. The roan was wild-eyed and pulling at the tie line, and Clara got her hands on the halter and talked to her. Not calming words. There was no time for calming. Just her voice. Just the anchor of a familiar voice, and got the tie loose, and pulled the horse out of the stall and toward the door. She handed the roan off into the yard and went back. Caleb had 2 of the other horses already moving. The third was in the back stall, the most disoriented, pulling back against the halter with the full weight of a terrified animal, and Caleb was using both hands and everything he had to keep the horse moving forward. Clara came up alongside and grabbed the lead from the left side, adding her weight to the direction he needed, and together they moved the horse forward through the smoke and out the door and into the yard, where they let her go, and she bolted to the far fence and stood there trembling. They stood outside the barn, both coughing, and Caleb looked at the south wall, and then he turned and looked toward the tree line 60 yards east of the property. Clara looked too. She thought she saw movement, a shift of shadow in the pines. a horse shape standing very still watching. "Someone's there," she said. Caleb's face was lit by the fire, and what was on it was not panic, and was not grief, and was not even anger in the way anger usually presents. It was colder than that, more deliberate. "Yes," he said. She grabbed his arm. "Don't." He looked at her. "Don't go into the trees alone in the dark after a man Crowley sent up here," she said. "That's what they want. You out there alone, away from witnesses." She kept her grip on his arm. "Let the barn burn what it's going to burn. Let them watch. Let them report back to Crowley that you stood here and didn't take the bait." He was breathing hard. Not from the smoke, from the effort of not moving. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her hand on his arm, at her face in the firelight. He stayed. They stood there together, and they watched the south wall burn, and then Caleb got water from the well, and Clara worked the bucket line, and they saved the structure. Most of the roof gone. The south wall collapsed, but the frame standing the horses safe, and by the time the sky started going gray in the east, they were standing in the yard covered in ash and sweat and smoke, and Clara's arms were shaking with the effort of the last 3 hours. Caleb looked at what was left of the barn. Then he looked at Clara. He said, "You stopped me from doing something that would have ended badly." "Yes," she said. That required a certain amount of nerve," he said. "Given my state at the time." "I know what your state was," she said. "That's why I did it." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was coming up behind him, thin and pale, and he looked exhausted and scorched, and absolutely present in the way that people get when they have come through something real. "I need to get word to Krell today," he said, "and to the county sheriff." "I'll write the account," Clara said. "Everything I saw, the movement in the tree line, the time it started, the direction of the fire's origin on the south wall, which means it was set from outside, not inside." She held his gaze. "This is Crowley. We both know it. And now we have an incident that is not a legal filing and not a pulled fence post. This is criminal action, and it happened on your property, and we have a record of the pattern that led to it." Caleb stared at her. She said, "Do you have paper?" He let out a breath that was not quite a laugh, but had something in it that was not grief either. "Yes," he said. "I have paper." "Then let's go inside," she said. He nodded. He turned toward the house. At the door he stopped, and he turned back, and he said, "Clara." She looked at him. "When all of this is over," he said, "I'm going to tell you something I've been working up to for 3 weeks." She didn't ask what it was. "All right," she said. "I'll be here." He went inside. Clara stood in the yard for one more moment looking at what was left of the barn against the pale morning sky, at the horses standing quiet at the far fence. Now that the danger had passed, at the smoke still rising in thin threads from the collapsed wall. Crowley had come in the night with fire, and had lost the horses, and had left a trail of evidence that a county sheriff and a circuit court judge were going to find very difficult to overlook. He had meant to frighten them. What he had done instead was make the next step obvious. Clara went inside to get the paper. Clara wrote for 2 hours without stopping. She sat at the table with Caleb's ledger open beside her own cross-referencing dates, pulling every entry she had made since the day the riders came up the trail, and she built the account the way she had always absorbed information methodically, precisely without decoration. Because decoration was what people added when they weren't confident in the facts, and she was entirely confident in these facts because she had been watching and remembering every single one of them. When she was done, she had 7 pages. She pushed them across the table to Caleb, who had been sitting across from her the entire time, working through his own set of records and not speaking, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him. He did not fill silence with noise, and he did not interrupt work with conversation, and those 2 qualities alone put him in a category almost entirely separate from every other person she had spent significant time with. He read through her pages slowly. He read them the way he read fence lines, checking for gaps, looking for anything that didn't hold. When he finished, he set them down and looked at her. "This is thorough," he said. "It's accurate," she said. "Thorough is just what accurate looks like when someone actually bothers." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "I'm writing to the sheriff's office in Caldwell this morning. It's a 2-hour ride. I want this on record before Crowley has time to shape the story." "I know," she said. "I'm coming with you." He started to say something. "I'm a witness," she said before he could. "I was in the barn. I saw the movement in the tree line. My account corroborates yours, and it's more complicated for a sheriff to dismiss two consistent witnesses than one." She met his eyes. "And I'm not staying up here alone the morning after someone set our barn on fire." He closed his mouth. He nodded once. "We leave in 20 minutes. The ride to Caldwell was harder than the ride to Red Hollow. The road ran along the edge of the ridge for the first 5 miles and required attention, and they made it without speaking much, both of them moving with the particular focused quiet of people who have something important ahead of them and are saving their energy for it. Sheriff Dale Pruitt was a broad, slow-moving man who had been in office for 11 years and had the expression of someone who had heard most of what the world had to say and had formed opinions about very little of it. He was behind his desk when they came in, and he looked at Caleb Stone with recognition, and at Clara with the recalibrating look she was becoming accustomed to, and he said, "Stone, heard you got married." "I did," Caleb said. "This is Clara. We have an incident to report." Pruitt looked at both of them for a moment. Then he reached for a blank report form. "Sit down, he said. "Tell me what happened." Clara told it. She told it in the same order she had written it, the same precise sequence, and she did not editorialize, and she did not speculate. She only stated what she had seen, and when she had seen it, and when she got to the movement in the tree line, she described it exactly a shape. A horse, stationary watching from the east tree line for approximately 40 seconds before it withdrew, and Pruitt wrote every word down without interrupting. When she finished, Caleb laid the written account on the desk in front of Pruitt. "That's her full documentation," he said. "And here's mine." He set his own pages beside hers. "The barn fire is the latest in a pattern going back 6 weeks. All of it is recorded." Pruitt looked at the pages. He didn't pick them up right away. He looked at Caleb first and said, "You're saying this is Crowley?" "I'm saying the fire started on the south wall set from outside on the same night we attended the Red Hollow Market, and Crowley learned publicly that Amos Krell has located the final survey document that invalidates his land claim." Caleb's voice was even. "I'm not speculating. I'm presenting a sequence of events and letting you draw your conclusion." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Clara watched him turn things over behind his eyes. He was not a man who moved fast in any direction, but she could see that he was not a stupid man either. He understood what he was looking at. "Crowley has friends in this county," Pruitt said. It was not a defense of Crowley. It was a statement of the landscape. "I know that," Caleb said. "Which is why I'm here this morning instead of next week. I want this dated and entered before anyone has the opportunity to manage what version of events the county hears first." Pruitt picked up the pages. He read through them. He took his time with it, and Clara sat across the desk from him and kept her hands in her lap and her breathing steady, and let him take whatever time he needed, because hurrying a man like Pruitt would only make him feel pressured, and a pressured Pruitt would become an obstacle, and they could not afford obstacles this morning. When he set the pages down, he said, "I'll need to ride up and see the barn." "Come today," Caleb said, "before anyone else does." Pruitt looked at him. A long, measuring look. Then he said, "Give me an hour." They waited outside. The morning was fully arrived now, the summer heat coming up fast, and Clara stood at the rail of the hitching post and looked at the street and thought about the shape of what they were doing, building a structure of fact, layer by layer, each one anchored to the one below, so that by the time anything came to a hearing or a confrontation, the structure was too solid to be knocked over by a single person's word against another's. "He'll come," Caleb said. He was standing beside her close enough that she could hear him without him raising his voice. "I know," she said. "Pruitt is honest, just slow." "Slow is fine," Caleb said. "Slow and honest beats fast and compromised every time." She glanced at him. "You've thought about this a lot." "I've been thinking about it for 2 years," he said. "Since Crowley took the Miller farm." He paused. "I watched Len Miller lose everything he'd built because he went at it angry instead of careful. He gave Crowley exactly the kind of confrontation Crowley is good at, public, emotional, easy to paint as unstable." His jaw moved. I swore I wasn't going to let that happen with Stone Ridge. And then I showed up, Clara said. He looked at her. And then you showed up, he agreed. And you turned out to be the most careful person I've ever dealt with. She didn't say anything to that, but she felt it land somewhere in her chest and stay there. Pruitt came to the mountain with a deputy who was young enough to still look alert, and he walked the burned section of the barn with Caleb, while Clara stood back and watched and let the men do the examination. Not because she couldn't contribute, but because she understood the particular dynamic of a county sheriff who needed to feel like the authority in the room in order to act like one. Pruitt crouched at the base of the south wall for a long time. He stood up. He looked at the angle of the burn pattern. He walked around the outside of the wall and crouched again. He came back to where Caleb was standing and said, "Set from outside. Something accelerant, probably lamp oil, against the base of the wall." He dusted his hands off. "This wasn't an accident." "No," Caleb said. "It wasn't." "Can't prove Crowley ordered it," Pruitt said. "Not from this." "No," Caleb said. "But the pattern is documented, and this incident is now reported. The next time something happens, and there will be a next time, because men like Crowley don't stop at one. It's not a first incident. It's a third and fourth in a series." Pruitt looked at him steadily. "You sound like a lawyer." "I sound like a man who's been paying attention," Caleb said. Pruitt left with his deputy 2 hours later, and Clara and Caleb stood in the yard and watched them ride down the mountain, and when they were gone, Clara let out a breath she had been holding at partial capacity for most of the day. "Good," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "He believed us." "He believed the burn pattern," Caleb said. "Which is better? Belief is personal. Evidence is structural." She looked at the burned section of the barn. "We need to rebuild." "Yes." "I can help with that." He looked at her. "I know you can." She turned to go inside and he said, "Clara." She stopped. "You were right this morning," he said. "About coming. 2 witnesses. The documentation you had ready." He paused. "I would have gone alone and done half the job." She turned to look at him. "You would have done fine." "Not as well," he said. "And I want you to know that I know the difference." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "So do I," and went inside. The letter from Amos Krell arrived 4 days after the barn fire, and it landed in Clara's hands at the post box at the bottom of the mountain, at the same moment that something else was happening that she didn't know about yet. Krell had filed the final survey document. It was certified and entered into the board's record. The hearing was in 10 days, and Krell's letter was confident in a way that legal letters rarely are. He had found in the process of pulling the Billings record not only the final survey, but an additional notation in the original surveyor's log, indicating that the preliminary record had been flagged as superseded. Crowley's attorney had filed the preliminary document knowing it had been flagged, knowing it had been superseded. That was not an oversight. That was fraud. Clara read that word and read it again. She put the letter in the saddlebag and started back up the mountain. She was halfway up when she met Hector Reyes coming down on foot, which was wrong enough that she pulled up immediately, because Hector did not walk the mountain trail for casual reasons. He was breathing hard, and his face was tight with something she recognized as urgency being held under control by a very determined man. "Hector," she said. "What's happened?" He stopped beside her horse and looked up at her. "Crowley moved this morning," he said. "He went to Judge Farrow. Not about the land claim about you." Clara stilled. "About me." "He filed a petition," Hector said, claiming the marriage arrangement was coerced, that Vera Bloom was acting under duress when she agreed to the terms, that the arrangement should be dissolved and the property question addressed without you involved. He held her eyes. "He's trying to remove you from the equation. If you're not legally Caleb's wife, you're not a party to the property dispute. Your testimony, your documentation, your standing as a witness, all of it becomes complicated." Clara sat very still on her horse for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "He can't file that claim. The arrangement was legal. Magistrate Holden performed the ceremony. It's entered in the county record." "Farrow is one of the review board members," Hector said. He can introduce the challenge at the hearing itself, create enough procedural confusion that the board asks for a continuance, and a continuance gives Crowley time to find another angle, Clara said. Yes. She looked up the trail. When did he file? This morning, 2 hours ago. Hector looked at her with an expression that was apologetic and determined in equal measure. I heard about it from Webb's assistant. The man has a conscience, apparently, even if Webb doesn't. How long before it's actionable? Farrow could raise it at the hearing, 10 days. Hector paused. Unless it's answered before then. Clara looked at him. What does answering it look like? A statement from Vera herself, Hector said, affirming that the arrangement was voluntary, that she was not under duress, that she consented of her own free will. He paused. Which is a complicated thing to ask for, given that Vera is the one who put you in this position to begin with. It was a complicated thing. Clara turned it over in her mind, quickly looking at all the angles the way she had learned to look at problems. Not the emotional shape of it, but the practical one. The one with a solvable structure underneath the feeling. Vera had handed her over to settle a debt. There was no version of that which was admirable. But Vera was also a woman who had spent her whole life in a county where Crowley owned pieces of everything, and she had been afraid, and fear made people do things that the same people in different circumstances might never have considered. Clara did not forgive it. She was not at the stage of forgiving it, and might never entirely get there. But she understood it, and understanding it was enough to know that Vera was not Crowley. Vera was someone who had been cornered and had made a terrible choice. And a person who had been cornered by Crowley might also be willing, given the right approach, to say so in writing. I need to talk to Vera, Clara said. Hector blinked. He had not expected that. I need to talk to her today, Clara said. Can you get word to her? Tell her I'm coming. Not Caleb, just me. Clara. Hector. She met his eyes. Can you get word to her? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, yes, I can do that. She rode back up the mountain. She told Caleb everything Krell's letter first, because the fraud finding needed to be in his hands immediately, and then Hector's news, because there was no version of this that benefited from him hearing it later. He read Krell's letter standing in the yard. When he got to the word fraud, his jaw set in that particular way she had learned to recognize as deep anger being held under very deliberate management. Then she told him about Crowley's petition regarding the marriage. He was quiet for a very long moment. He's trying to remove you, he said. His voice was lower than usual. Yes, because you're the piece of this he didn't anticipate, Caleb said. He expected me to be alone. One man easier to pressure, easier to isolate. He looked at her. He didn't expect you to be what you are. What am I? She said. He looked at her with that full, complete look. Effective, he said, which was not the word she had expected, and which was because of that considerably more significant than a warmer word would have been coming from a different man. I'm going to talk to Vera, she said. He went very still. Clara, I know, she said. I know what she did, but her statement could close Crowley's petition before it ever reaches Farrow. If she affirms that the arrangement was voluntary, the challenge disappears. She held his gaze. And I think she'll do it. Not for me. Not because she's sorry she may never be sorry, not in the way I'd want. But because Crowley is the reason she was in that position to begin with. He pressured her debt. He made her afraid. And if she understands that giving a statement against his petition is a way to get out from under what he used her for, you're betting she cares more about being free of Crowley than she cares about staying comfortable. Caleb said. Yes. He looked at her steadily. That's a significant bet. I know Vera, Clara said. Not well and not warmly. But I know her. She did what she did because she was afraid of losing the house. She's been afraid of Crowley for years. If I give her a way to push back at him without putting herself directly in his path... She paused. I think she'll take it. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. I don't want you going alone. I need to go alone, she said. If you come, it becomes about the property dispute. If it's just me, it's a conversation between two women, and that's the only version of this conversation that has a chance of working. He looked at the ground. He looked back at her. He said, "You come back before dark." "I'll come back before dark," she said. He nodded. He did not look happy about it, which was a feeling that Clara registered somewhere in her chest as something she did not have a clean word for, but that was not unpleasant. Vera Bloom's house was on the west side of Red Hollow, a square, neat structure with a kitchen garden that had always been better tended than anything else in Vera's life, because Vera was a woman who understood order in small spaces, even when everything outside them was chaos. She answered the door before Clara knocked, which meant she had been watching the road, which meant she had decided to do this before Clara arrived, or was at least open to it, which was all the opening Clara needed. They sat at Vera's kitchen table. There was no offer of coffee. There was no pretense of warmth. Just two women sitting down to negotiate something that needed to be negotiated. Vera looked older than she had a month ago. Or maybe Clara was just seeing her differently now from outside the position of someone who needed something from her. "I know why you're here," Vera said. "Then you know what I need," Clara said. "A statement," Vera said. Affirming the arrangement was voluntary. Yes. Vera was quiet. She looked at the table. She said, "It was voluntary, in the sense that nobody put a gun to my head." Her voice was dry and a little bitter. "In the sense that I had run out of every other option because Nathan Crowley had made certain of it." "I know," Clara said. She said it without heat, without accusation, because this conversation did not have room for either of those things. Vera looked up at her. "You're not angry." "I was," Clara said. "I still am some. But anger isn't what I came here with today." Vera studied her for a moment. "You're different," she said, "since you went up that mountain." "Yes," Clara said. "I am." "The mountain cowboy treats you well." "Better than well," Clara said. "Vera, Crowley used your debt to get what he wanted, and what he wanted was leverage over Caleb's land. You were the tool he used to get it, and now he's filing a petition to use you again to challenge the marriage to remove me from the legal proceedings to buy himself more time before the board hears that his attorney filed fraudulent documentation." Vera's head came up. "Fraudulent. Krell found it," Clara said. The preliminary survey document Crowley's attorney filed was flagged as superseded in the original record. They knew. They filed it anyway. She let that sit for a moment. "Crowley doesn't just want Caleb's land. He wants to make sure no one can stop him from taking it. And you are right now the one thing that can stop his petition cold before it ever reaches the board." Vera was quiet. Clara could see the calculation happening, not greed, not self-interest in the petty sense, but the larger self-interest of a woman who had spent years being afraid of Nathan Crowley, and was now looking at the shape of a world where he had been caught at something serious. "If he goes down," Vera said slowly, "he goes down hard." "Yes," Clara said. "And if he's still standing after," Vera said, "and I've given a statement against his petition, he'll come for you," Clara said honestly. She was not going to lie to make this easier. "But Krell has the fraud documentation. Pruitt has a report on the barn fire. Caleb has 2 years of records. Crowley is not going to be standing long enough to come for anyone." Vera looked at her for a long moment. "You believe that?" Vera said. "I do," Clara said. Vera looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She said, "Your mother would have done exactly what you're doing right now. Walked back into the room that hurt her and tried to fix it." Clara did not expect that. She felt it move through her chest, like something aching and warm at the same time. "Will you give the statement?" she said. Vera was quiet for 5 seconds. 10. Then she said, "Get me paper." Clara pulled a folded sheet from inside her coat. She set it on the table. She set a pen beside it. Vera looked at them. She picked up the pen. She wrote. It took her 4 minutes to write 7 sentences, and those 7 sentences accounted for every fact necessary. The voluntary nature of the arrangement, the absence of duress on Vera's part, the date the witness present the signature. She pushed it back across the table. Clara folded it carefully. She put it inside her coat. "Thank you," she said. Vera nodded. She looked like a woman who has put something down that she has been carrying for a long time and was only now noticing how much it weighed. At the door she said, "Clara." Clara turned. "I know it wasn't right," Vera said. "What I did. I know it." She looked at the floor, then back up. "I don't expect you to. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I know." Clara held her gaze for a moment. "I know you know," she said. "That's why I came to you instead of around you." She left Vera standing in her doorway, and she rode back up the mountain with the statement folded against her chest and the last light of the day going orange and long across the valley below her. She was through the gate with 20 minutes of daylight to spare. Caleb was on the porch. He stood up when she came through the gate, and she could read in the way he stood. Everything he hadn't said when she left the worry. He had held all afternoon the effort of staying on the property instead of following her. The relief that arrived the moment he saw her face and understood from it that it had gone the way it needed to go. She dismounted and walked to the porch and held out the folded paper. He took it. He read it. He looked up. "Vera signed it," he said. "Vera signed it," Clara said. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something building behind his expression, something that had been building for weeks. She realized accumulating the way things accumulate when a person is careful with them, and she thought this might be the moment when it came out, and she stood very still and let it. He said, "I told you in the barn that I had something to say when this was over." "You did," she said. "It's not over," he said. "There's the hearing, there's Krell's case, there's still a week of uncertain ground." He paused. "But I don't want to wait anymore." She looked at him. "I don't know how to say this in the way that people say it in books," he said. "I've never been good with words that are meant to be felt instead of used." He looked at her directly the way he always did when he meant something completely. "But you walked into a courthouse a month ago in a dress that didn't fit, and you held your chin level the entire way, and you have not stopped once. Not for Crowley, not for the town, not for me when I was wrong about how to handle something. You have not stopped, and you have not flinched, and I have watched a woman who was told her whole life that she was worth nothing prove every single one of those people wrong in ways they don't even fully understand yet." Clara's chest was doing something she had no control over. "Caleb," she started. "I'm not finished," he said, quietly, without heat. She stopped. "I don't want you here because the arrangement said so," he said. "I don't want you here because you're useful, though you are considerably. I want you here because this place is better with you in it, and because I am better with you in it, and because somewhere in the last month I stopped thinking about what I lost 7 years ago and started thinking about what I have now." He paused. "And I wanted you to know that, plainly, without a lot of decoration around it." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "That was not without a lot of decoration." Something moved across his face. It was the thing that happened when she surprised him, but this time it went further than usual. It went all the way to a smile, not a large one, but a real one, and it changed the shape of his face in a way that she had never seen before, and that she found she very much wanted to see again. "No," he said. "I suppose it wasn't." She went up the 2 porch steps and stood in front of him and looked up at him in the last of the evening light and said, "I want to be here. Not because the arrangement said so, because I want to be." He looked down at her, and something in his face settled. Not closed. The opposite of closed. Something that had been braced for a long time, releasing the brace very carefully, and he said, "Good." She reached up and put her hand briefly against the side of his jaw, the scarred side, and felt him go very still under her hand, and then she dropped it and stepped back and turned toward the house, because some moments you give space to by moving forward instead of staying inside them. "Supper," she said. "And then we need to get the statement to Krell first thing tomorrow." "Yes," he said. His voice was different than she had ever heard it. Quieter, more interior. She went inside. He stayed on the porch a moment longer. When he came in, they sat at the table and ate supper, and there was no particular declaration, no formal acknowledgement of what had just happened in the evening air between them. But the shape of the room was different. The shape of the table was different. The shape of the silence between them had changed into something that Clara did not have a previous experience to compare it to. Not because it was romantic in the way the books described, but because it was honest. Because it was chosen. Because two people who had both spent too many years being something determined by other people's decisions had just very quietly decided something for themselves. Outside the mountain held the last of the light. Inside the lamp burned steady. 10 days to the hearing. And for the first time since she had stood in that courthouse in the blue dress that didn't fit, Clara Whitmore went to sleep without counting anything at all. The 10 days before the hearing were the longest of Clara's life, and also in some ways the fullest. She and Caleb rode to Caldwell together, the morning after she returned from Vera's, and she handed Vera's statement directly to Amos Krell in his office, while Caleb stood beside her and said almost nothing, because there was nothing to say that the document didn't say better. Krell read it twice, looked up at Clara over the top of his reading glasses and said, "This closes Crowley's petition entirely. Pharaoh can't raise a procedural challenge on a marriage the ward's guardian has affirmed in writing." He set it down with the careful satisfaction of a man who has been handed exactly the piece he needed. "Where did you get this?" "From Vera Bloom," Clara said. "She gave it voluntarily." Krell looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Then he looked back at Clara. "You went to her yourself?" "Yes." "After what she did?" "The statement was what mattered," Clara said. "Not how I felt about the person giving it." Krell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Stone, if you ever want to read law, I would take you on as a clerk without a second thought." Caleb made a sound beside her that was almost certainly the closest thing to a laugh she had heard from him yet. She kept her face even. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. The days between the Krell meeting and the hearing were occupied with work. The barn repairs that could not wait, the fence line that needed reinforcing on the eastern boundary. The garden that had become somewhere in the last month. Something Clara considered genuinely hers. She worked alongside Caleb on all of it, and she noticed that the way they worked together had shifted. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. But the distance that had existed in the first week's careful, mutual appropriate had contracted into something closer. He handed her things before she asked for them. She knew which tasks he'd handle first, and positioned herself accordingly. They moved around each other with the particular efficiency of two people who have stopped having to think about where the other one is. On the fifth night, they were on the porch after supper, when Caleb said out of nowhere, "Crowley's clerk, Gerald Webb. Krell told me he's been quietly contacted by the Territorial Land Commissioner's office." Clara turned to look at him. "About what?" "About the fraudulent filing," Caleb said. Apparently, the Commissioner's office had already been watching Crowley's activity in 3 counties. The barn fire report that Pruitt entered, and the documentation we gave him triggered a review that was already in motion. She stared at him. "You're telling me Crowley was already under investigation?" "From a distance," Caleb said. "Nothing that had reached the stage of action. But our records combined with Krell's fraud finding, combined with Pruitt's arson report, it gave the Commissioner's office enough to elevate the review." "That's not just a land dispute anymore," Clara said. "That's a federal matter." "Yes," Caleb said. "Which is why Crowley went so hard at us so fast. He wasn't just trying to take the land. He was trying to eliminate a witness trail before it connected to anything bigger." Clara absorbed this. She thought about the pulled fence posts, the riders on the trail, the fire in the night, the petition about the marriage. Each one of those things viewed separately looked like the aggression of a man who wanted one piece of land. Viewed together, they looked like the desperation of a man who needed something erased before a much larger structure came down. "He panicked," she said. "Yes." "Which means he made mistakes." "Considerable ones," Caleb said. Clara looked at the dark shape of the mountains. "The hearing is in 5 days. What happens if the Commissioner's office moves before then?" "Krell thinks they'll wait," Caleb said. "Let the hearing establish the fraud finding in the local record. Then the federal review has a foundation to build from." He paused. "Either way, Crowley knows the hearing isn't going his way. He has to know by now that Krell has the final survey, that Vera's statement killed his petition, that the arson report exists." He looked at Clara. A man like that, when he sees the walls coming in, he either runs or he does something reckless. She looked at him. Which do you think he'll do? Caleb was quiet for a moment. He's not a man who runs, he said. She nodded. Then we watched the next 5 days carefully. He looked at her in the dark. I was going to say that anyway, he said, but I appreciate you saying it first. On the 7th day, Nathan Crowley came to the mountain himself. Clara was in the garden when she heard the hoofbeats, one horse coming up the main trail at a deliberate pace, not fast, not sneaking. An arrival that wanted to be seen. She straightened and looked toward the gate, and Caleb came out of the house at the same moment, and they both stood in the yard when Crowley rode through the gate. He looked different than he had at the market. The good coat was the same, but something underneath it had changed. Some quality of ease that had always been present in the way he moved through the world was absent now, and in its place was a tightness that he was working to conceal and not entirely succeeding. He stopped his horse 10 feet from where they stood. He looked at Caleb first, then at Clara, then back at Caleb. I'd like to talk, he said, man to man. My wife stays, Caleb said. His voice was flat. Something moved across Crowley's face. Of course, he said, which cost him something. I've come to make a proposal. We're listening, Caleb said. Crowley looked between them. He had the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is now encountering conditions the rehearsal didn't account for. The hearing in 3 days, I think we both know it isn't going to go the way either of us wants. Protracted legal proceedings, county resources, tied up publicity that doesn't serve anyone. He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. I'm prepared to withdraw the land claim entirely. The water rights dispute the boundary question, all of it. In exchange for Stone Ridge's formal withdrawal from any further complaint or proceeding against Crowley land and cattle. Clara felt Caleb go still beside her. She spoke before he could. You want us to withdraw our documentation from the county record, she said. The arson report, the incident log, all of it. Crowley's eyes moved to her. A formal resolution that allows both parties to move forward, he said. What you're describing, Clara said, is asking us to bury evidence of criminal action in exchange for you not pursuing a fraudulent legal claim. She let that sit for exactly 1 beat. That's not a proposal. That's an attempt to use a negotiation to accomplish what you couldn't accomplish with a fire. The reasonableness left Crowley's face. What was underneath it was not pleasant. You're a young woman who's been on this mountain 5 weeks, he said. I'd be careful about the positions you take on things you don't fully understand. I understand them completely, Clara said. She did not raise her voice. She did not step back. I understand that you filed a superseded survey document knowing it had been flagged. I understand that you sent men up this mountain to pull fence posts and deliver threats. I understand that on the night of the Red Hollow market, when you learned that Amos Krell had found the final survey record, someone set fire to our barn from the outside using an accelerant. She met his eyes. And I understand that the Territorial Land Commissioner's Office has been watching Crowley land and cattle in 3 counties, and that the documentation we provided to Sheriff Pruitt contributed to elevating their review. Crowley went very still. Clara continued. You didn't come up here to offer us a deal. You came up here to find out how much we know. She tilted her head slightly. Now you know. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then Caleb said in the low, even voice that Clara had learned was his most serious register, Get off my property, Crowley. Don't come back. Crowley looked at Caleb. He looked at Clara. And for the first time since she had encountered this man, she saw something in his face that was not calculation, not confidence, not the smooth assurance of a man who believes he is operating in terrain he controls. She saw fear. He turned his horse and rode back through the gate without another word. Caleb watched him go. His jaw was set, and his hands were at his sides, and Clara could read in the line of his shoulders every controlled impulse of the last 7 weeks. When the hoofbeats faded down the trail, he said, You told him about the commissioner's office. Yes, she said. Krell told us that in confidence. Krell told us so we'd know the scope of what we were dealing with, she said. I used it because Crowley needed to understand that this is not a local matter he can manage with local pressure. She looked at him. He'll run now, or he'll make a final move, but it won't be against us. He knows we're documented. He'll go after something he thinks is softer. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. How are you this certain? Because I watched him hear it, she said. That was fear, Caleb. That man has been operating from confidence his whole career, and I just watched confidence leave his face. She paused. We need to get word to Krell and to Pruitt today. Tell them Crowley came to the property what he offered, what I told him. Get it on record before he moves. Caleb was already turning toward the barn to saddle the horses. He stopped. He turned back. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the measuring look, not the quiet appreciation, not even the thing that had been on his face on the porch 5 nights ago. This was something more stripped down than all of those. Something that was just true. When I agreed to come to that courthouse, he said, I thought I was doing something simple, settling a debt, giving a woman a choice. He shook his head once. I had no idea. Clara looked at him. Neither did I, she said. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he went to saddle the horses. The hearing convened on a Tuesday morning in a courtroom that was considerably more crowded than anyone had anticipated. Word had gotten through Red Hollow, in the way that significant things always got through Red Hollow, not through any official announcement, but through the accumulation of overheard conversations of Hector Reyes, telling 3 people who each told 5 more of Amos Krell's confident manner when he was seen entering the courthouse of the visible absence of Judge Farrow from the review board, which nobody had officially explained, but which everyone had noticed. Farrow had recused himself 2 days before the hearing. Krell had told them privately that the Territorial Commissioner's office had made a quiet request, and Farrow had quietly complied, which was the kind of compliance that happened when a man understood that the alternative was considerably worse. The board that convened consisted of 3 members Clara had not seen before, brought in from Billings, she learned because the Commissioner's office had formally flagged the case as compromised at the local level. That flag, Krell explained in the hallway before the hearing, was itself a consequence of the documentation. Every piece of paper you produced, Krell said to Clara quietly, while Caleb signed the final affidavit at the clerk's table. Every dated entry, every incident description, every cross-referenced event. It built a record that the Commissioner's office could use to justify external oversight. You did that. He paused. I want you to understand that. The legal outcome today would not have been possible without the structure you built. Clara looked at him steadily. We built, she said. Caleb and I. Krell nodded. We built, he said. Inside the courtroom, Nathan Crowley sat at the opposing table with his attorney, and he looked like a man who has assessed a battlefield and found it substantially different from what his intelligence suggested. He looked at Clara once when she came in, and then did not look at her again, which told her everything she needed to know about how he had processed their last conversation. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Krell presented the final survey document. First Certified notarized the original surveyor's flag notation, highlighted in the margin. He presented the preliminary document that Crowley's attorney had filed alongside it, with the superseded notation visible to anyone who looked. He presented Pruitt's arson report, dated and signed. He presented Clara's incident log, entered as a formal exhibit, 12 pages of dated precise entries that the board members read through with expressions that moved progressively from neutral to attentive, to something that looked very much like recognition of a pattern. He presented Vera's statement last. Crowley's attorney objected to it. The objection was overruled. Then Crowley's attorney presented his case, which had been considerably weakened by the loss of the only document that supported the boundary claim, and which had been further complicated by the fact that 2 members of the board had received that morning a formal notice from the Territorial Commissioner's office indicating that Crowley Land and Cattle was under active review for fraudulent filing practices in 3 counties. That notice had not been part of the original proceedings. It had arrived that morning. When Krell had seen it standing in the courthouse hallway, he had looked at it for a long moment and then handed it to Caleb and said, "The commissioner moved." Caleb had handed it to Clara. She had read it and felt something settle in her chest, with the particular solidity of something that has been uncertain for a long time and is no longer uncertain. The board deliberated for 40 minutes. Clara sat beside Caleb in the gallery and did not speak and did not move, and she felt his arm against hers on the bench, the solid warmth of it, and she did not pull away from it, and neither did he. When the board returned, the chair read the finding in the flat procedural voice of official proceedings, and the finding was this: the original boundary of Stone Ridge, as established by the final survey document, was confirmed. The water rights claim was dismissed. The preliminary filing by Crowley's attorney was referred to the Territorial Commissioner's office for further review. The marriage challenge petition was dismissed on the basis of the voluntary statement submitted by the ward's guardian. Stone Ridge was Caleb's. The water was Caleb's. The boundary held where it had always held. Crowley left the courtroom without speaking to anyone. His attorney gathered his papers with the careful movements of a man who was already calculating the distance between himself and his client. Clara watched them go. She felt Caleb's hand cover hers on the bench. Not a dramatic gesture, not a performance for the room. Just his hand covering hers with the steady weight of something real. She turned her hand over and held his. Outside the courthouse, the crowd that had gathered, and it was a crowd more of Red Hollow than she had expected, fell quiet when she and Caleb came through the doors. Not the speculative quiet of the courthouse steps 2 months ago. A different quiet. The quiet of people who have watched a story conclude in a way they weren't entirely sure it would, and who were still absorbing it. Hector Reyes was at the front of the crowd. He looked at Clara with an expression that was trying very hard not to be emotional and was not succeeding. She went to him and she said, "Thank you for what you did at the beginning." He shook his head. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. "All of us who kept watch when it mattered." He nodded. He shook Caleb's hand with both of his, and Caleb let him, which Clara knew was not nothing. Margaret Delaney was there too, and 2 of the Pearson brothers, and a handful of people whose faces Clara knew from years of being invisible among them. Some of them came forward. Some of them didn't. That was all right. She wasn't looking for vindication from the crowd. She had stopped needing it somewhere on the mountain in the daily work of building something real. What she was looking for was already standing beside her. They rode back up the mountain in the late afternoon, and the summer light was long and amber across the valley, and the pines caught it and turned gold in it, the way they only did in these particular hours. Clara rode beside Caleb on the run he had given her the morning of their marriage, and she thought about who she had been on the road to that courthouse, and who she was on this road now, and the distance between those 2 people was not measured in miles. She had arrived on this mountain with nothing except a dress that didn't fit, and a chin she had learned to keep level. She was leaving the road with a legal proceeding behind her that had helped bring down a man who had been hurting this county for years. A document log that had become formal evidence in a federal review, and a home she had chosen and built and defended with her own hands. She was 19 years old. She thought she was just getting started. At the gate, Caleb dismounted and held the gate for her, and as she rode through he said, "You're quiet." "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" She dismounted and walked the roan to the barn, and he walked beside her, and she said, "About what happens next. The barn still needs finishing. The eastern fence needs another 2 days of work. The late garden planting needs to go in before the end of the month." She paused. "Krell said there may be testimony required if the commissioner's review reaches a formal proceeding." "There may be," Caleb said. "I'll give it," she said, "if it's needed." He looked at her. "Of course you will." She glanced at him sideways. "You don't sound surprised." "I stopped being surprised by you somewhere around the 3rd day," he said. She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him in the last of the evening light at the scar on his jaw and the gray eyes and the face that she had been reading for 2 months, and could now read the way you read something you know well fluently, without effort, catching the things that were too small for anyone else to catch. She said, "That first morning, the note on the table, the room with the bolt on the inside, you had prepared all of that before you even met me." He nodded. "Yes. You were ready to give someone dignity before you knew who she was." He looked at her steadily. I knew enough, he said. Hector had told me. About the town. About what they'd done to you for years. His jaw tightened briefly. I knew enough to know what the minimum was. That wasn't a minimum, she said. That was more than most people manage with years of trying. He was quiet. She said, Caleb. He looked at her. I want to ask you something, she said. And I want you to answer it honestly, not carefully. All right, he said. When you came to that courthouse, she said, when you offered me the choice to leave, what did you want me to do? I was quiet for a long moment. The horses shifted in the barn behind them, and the evening settled around them, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her in the courtroom, when he put his hand over hers, not for anyone else's benefit, just because it was honest. I wanted you to stay, he said. I told myself I didn't. I told myself I was prepared for either answer. But when you said you'd stay... He stopped. I won't dress it up. I was glad. She held his gaze. I want you to know something too. All right. I said I'd stay because the door led back to Red Hollow, and I was out of options, she said. That was true then. It is not what's true now. She took one step toward him, close enough that she had to look up to hold his eyes. Now I'd stay because I want to. Because this is my home, and you are the reason I know what that word means, and I have never once in the 2 months I've been on this mountain felt like something to be managed. Her voice was steady, completely steady. You gave me a bolt on the inside of a door before you knew my name, and I am going to spend a long time not taking that for granted. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached up and touched her face, his hand rough from 12 years of outdoor work against her cheek. Careful in the way that large hands are careful when they are holding something they don't want to damage. And he said quietly, You were never something to be managed, Clara. You were always someone to be known. She put her hand over his. They stood there in the yard of Stone Ridge as the last of the summer light went amber and then copper and then soft, and the mountains held the color long after everything below them had gone to shadow, and neither of them spoke, because some things don't need words, and some moments are complete exactly as they are. Later inside, with the lamp burning, and the supper things cleared, and the evening quiet settling around the house, the way it did now. Familiar shaped by the two of them together. Caleb sat at the table with the survey documents and Krell's notes, beginning the process of organizing them for whatever federal proceedings might come. Clara sat across from him, with the incident log adding the final entries. The hearing date, the finding, the dismissal of the petition, the referral to the commissioner's office. She wrote the last entry in her careful, precise hand, and she set the pen down and looked at what she had built in 12 pages. A record, a structure of fact. The documented shape of a fight that had started before she arrived, and that she had walked into and helped finish. She looked up at Caleb, who was reading and making notes, and did not know she was looking at him. She looked at the lamp, at the bolted front door, at the 2 coffee cups on the shelf, hers now slightly to the left of his, because she had put it there on the second morning, and it had stayed. The mountain was not a soft place. The life here was not easy, and it was not going to become easy. There would be more legal proceedings, more work on the land, more seasons of difficult weather and difficult decisions. The federal review would make demands. The county would need testimony. Crowley's fall would create a vacuum that other men would try to fill, because that was how things worked in a county where too much had been held by too few for too long. She was 19 years old, and she had 2 months of this life behind her, and she intended to put 40 years more in front of it. She picked up the pen. She opened to a fresh page in the ledger. At the top, in the same careful hand, she wrote the date. Then below it she wrote, Stone Ridge, Year 1, and she began. Because a woman who had been handed nothing except a dress that didn't fit, and a courthouse full of people who had already decided her worth, had walked up a mountain and found something that no one in Red Hollow had ever thought to give her. Not rescue, not charity, not the conditional kindness of someone who wanted something in return. She had found a man who opened a door and stood back, and a life that asked only one thing of her, that she be exactly who she already was. And Clara Whitmore Stone, on the first evening of everything that came after, put her pen to the page and wrote herself forward into it with both hands.